If you're in my corner of TikTok, or if you've been sent this video, you've probably seen this discussion, because predominantly women all over this app bringing up something called the mental burden. The biggest catalyst for this discussion was actually this really wholesome video where a man teaches young boys how to grocery shop, except that he also teaches them to call their wives mid-aisle to figure out what to buy. A creator named Paige Turner actually went viral for breaking down this conversation and why this one detail matters. That gap between the doing and the actual knowing of the task is what this entire conversation is actually about. And if you're already thinking about counter arguments like, well, I work more hours than she does, I would do more if she just asked, her standards are just higher than mine, I've made every single one of these arguments myself, and I am actually going to address them fully much later in this video. In this video, I'm going to go through all of it: the research, the arguments, the counter arguments, and also my own personal journey of being a man who thought that I was doing fine, but in reality I had to learn that trying and internalizing are two very different things. Here's the 6 questions that guided this journey of mine into the wider discussion of why men broadly don't carry the mental burden, and how I learned to carry the mental burden more, not perfectly I might add, but better than before. Even though mental burden is a recent phenomenon that's being discussed online right now, the term itself was actually popularized back in 2017 by a French cartoonist named Emma. The overall takeaway, as you can guess, is that men who wait to be asked to do something will never be proactive in considering the many things you'll have to do in life, which is why we'll very much end up with stereotypes that do truly exist, with husbands with several children who still have to call their wives from the grocery store to ask what kind of food they like. I've been that guy myself, and to many dudes in relationships watching this, I'm sure you can relate to that same feeling as well. Mental burden, or mental load, is defined by 2 components that better explain why men tend to fall short in ways that women don't. The first is the cognitive part, which is the part that we all intuitively understand. The constant planning, that organizing that takes place in your head that any functioning adult needs to keep a household running. The second aspect of the mental burden or mental load is the emotional component, which is the part of the discussion that I feel like no one online is really talking about, and is the more important of the 2 components. It's the feeling of being internally responsible for everyone in your household, not just doing things for people, but feeling like it's actually your duty to make sure that everything is okay. The best way I can illustrate this difference is this: when a drink spills at a party, it's often the woman's first instinct to rush and clean it up, not because she was assigned it to it, but because she feels the state of the house is her responsibility. And for the record, I would also feel as just quickly responsible to clean that spill in the same way many men who are watching this probably would feel the same way as well. But the distinction I want to make more clearly is that my wife feels responsible for having a clean house, whereas I feel more focused on just cleaning up the mess that's in front of me. And that difference in the internal experience is backed up by research as well, because studies find that women are more significantly likely to internalize a household standard as part of their identity, while men tend to experience those same standards as external tasks to complete when they come up, which is why we can both care about a clean house and still have completely internal experiences when we look at it. That's the emotional part of mental burden that no one really talks about. This prevailing idea of what we ultimately feel responsible for, that's the part no one ever actually addresses. This is a story about 2 people standing in the same kitchen and seeing completely different things. And the reason we see differently almost has nothing to do with who we are as individuals, very clearly so based on the discussion online, but almost everything to do with what we were taught to look for as a society. Which brings us to the question I'm sure a lot of women watching this have been pretty much waiting for, which is, why is it that men genuinely don't see the way that women do? An experimental study specifically designed to isolate whether men and women have different preferences for how our housework gets divided found remarkably little evidence of any real gender difference in what people actually want. Both men and women showed a general preference towards equal distribution, which, when you strip away the social layer, it shows that the story really isn't about men being unwilling to be equal in their responsibilities. Research on how children are assigned household responsibilities finds that the tasks that boys and girls are assigned map almost perfectly onto the division of labor that shows up in adult relationships. For example, boys get assigned episodic tasks, so you have take out the trash, mow the lawn, fix the broken thing. There's a very clear beginning, and there's also a very clear end as well, so when you do it, you're done, so you stop thinking about it. Meanwhile, girls get assigned continuous tasks, so that includes cooking, cleaning, folding your laundry, and tracking what the house actually needs. These tasks constantly repeat themselves week after week, or even day after day. So when these tasks keep repeating themselves as often as they do until adulthood, this functions as the direct training for the role each person defaults to when they become adults. The data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics even confirms this pattern as well, as it carries until adulthood. Men do more significantly housework in categories where the labor is episodic rather than ongoing. The kid who took out the trash becomes the man who fixes the car, and the kid who cooked and tracked what was in the fridge becomes the woman that manages the entire household's mental inventory. I mean, when you really think about it, right? No one ever really just sits us down and tells us that this is what we must do because we're just men and women. This naturally just became the standard every household has ended up adopting before us even realizing that it was happening. Men were never told to look for these things the same way that women do, so we don't. And when our partners point at the corner behind the toaster, our honest internal response at first is usually some version of, well, it's not that big of a deal. Because to us, genuinely, this wasn't something that we were taught to be a big deal. This is definitely not the fault of men for having not known these things, but this isn't just a free pass either to avoid the responsibility once it's made known. And that's the part that I find most women online feel frustrated by. What you do once you've been told to clean the corner underneath the toaster is now where personal responsibility actually starts. So we've established what the mental burden is and why men don't see it. But I want to answer the question that I think is sitting underneath all this for a lot of people watching, especially men. Is this actually a big deal? Or is this one of those things that gets blown up online into something bigger than it actually is? And it turns out there's pretty specific reason why men and women don't have the same relationship with cleaning, for example, that goes all the way back much further than TikTok, and one actually about evolution. There's research on attachment styles that finds that men tend to be more avoidant than women, which means that when we go back to relationships, that when stresses do arise, men tend to pull back from it rather than toward it. It doesn't feel like withdrawal from the inside, because on the outside, it feels like everything is fine, which is the exact problem that women often have but aren't able to truly express, because the comfort of a stable relationship gets registered as equilibrium even when it's being actively maintained by only one person. And in fact, here's a finding that I think every man should actually sit with, because research using daily diary data found for men whose partners are doing more of that work, it actually predicted greater volatility in their own feelings of love and commitment over time, not less. So here's what that means in practice, right? Because the person doing all the work is holding the relationship together, and the person on the receiving end of that labor, without even reciprocating it, becomes certain that they want the relationship even less. And the stat that should end the "is this the big deal" conversation shows us as well, because women initiate nearly 70% of divorces in the United States consistently across decades of research. The part that gets rarely said alongside that number is that marriage benefits men more than women. In health, career outcomes, life expectancy, men have the most to lose from a marriage ending, and yet women are the ones ending it at nearly a 2-to-1 ratio. And this pattern repeats time and time again across all of social media, across different decades too, with the same sentiment. You'll hear time and time again women leave over small things like one unwashed dish, but what that really is the 400th unwashed dish, because they leave the partner who was shown, argue with, temporarily changed even, but all the while these men still quietly drift back to the same baseline, because the performance of growth without actually internalizing why we should do what we do, that's the tipping point for a lot of these women. And this of course raises a question that I think a lot of men are now asking, and it's one that I genuinely asked myself as time went on. Are women's standards actually too high? And if they are these unattainable standards worth striving for? Now, I do want to steel man this argument for a second, because it does deserve a fair hearing before I explain why this logic falls apart. So the argument goes like this, and it's one I've personally had before, so it's not like I'm just making it up. Her standards aren't objectively correct. Hers are just much higher than mine. If she has a lower tolerance for how clean the house is, or how often we should actually plan dates, why does her threshold automatically win? Why isn't the compromise meeting somewhere in the middle rather than me being expected to rise to her level? Compromise is great in every relationship, and we should all strive for it. But the problem is that compromise can become an excuse oftentimes for men for when you're actually negotiating for something small like wiping the back of a trash can. It's not a compromise to not want to clean something that is fundamentally dirty, and it does make you feel gross, and it definitely does hurt my pride to have admitted how wrong I've been so many times over dumb conversations like that should have been resolved. Split these tasks and organize them accordingly. Neither person is settling on the standards, and that both people are actually agreeing on these standards and working towards it together. That's what actually compromise looks like. Her standards are just too high. Stop being defensible when you apply it to not knowing your own social security number, or remembering to schedule your own annual physical and expecting your wife to do that for you. Knowing what's in your joint bank account, knowing what your kids are allergic to. These are things that I've predominantly seen a lot of older men, but men in general nowadays, that don't do things that we should do even if we were single, that we now just relinquish over to our wives because it's easier. These are basic adult responsibilities that one person is now holding for both people, not because because she decided her way is correct, but because someone has to do it, and her partner opted out without ever formally deciding to. And for the record, I'm not doing this section to appear fair, by the way. I'm doing it because I've made most of these arguments myself, and sometimes the only way to address these is to take some of these seriously. Some of these arguments do have real validity, and some of them do collapse under scrutiny, but it's worth addressing all nonetheless. I contribute in ways that don't get counted. I find that this can and often is the most legitimate counter-argument to have on this list, because car maintenance, home repairs, yard work, managing finances, each man will have a slightly different list of responsibilities than these, but the main point being is that these real contributions often do go unmeasured for most of this research that we have been citing. The honest refrain that we should have isn't that men contribute nothing, it's that men's contributions do, at the end of the day, tend to be episodic, and it doesn't solve the core issue of why women feel the way they do, even if men picked up the slack and did more of these episodic tasks. I would do more if you just asked. Now, this is one that I've been very, very guilty of, so I think this is worth most acknowledging most fairly, because what this question actually states when you look at it is that you'll execute the task, but the labor of what needs to be noticed and doing it and delegating it still remains the woman's job. The mental load hasn't been shared, it's just been outsourced back to the person already carrying it, but with one extra step added. Research confirms that this is self-reinforcing. Let's outline it very clearly. Because when women manage and delegate, men operate as helpers who wait to be asked, and the structure trains men to require direction than to initiate it. I want to really acknowledge these counter arguments because if we don't take them seriously, there is a byproduct of what will happen if they leave unignored for a very long time. So I wanted to share you some interactions that I had when I used to be a banker back then to really illustrate what happens when we leave things unaddressed for a long time. Now, a surprising amount of my time was spent taking care of divorcing couples. I feel like once a week I would have an appointment that involves removing one couple from another in their joint account and opening a new one's often for the men to start brand new. And what I hate seeing most, which immediately happens because again I often see this a lot in the boomers that I work with, is that the woman is usually too fed up to even talk to me or the man, all the while the man is just sitting there trying to make jokes to lighten the mood. As the man tries to make small talk with me, he'll act confused when I explain what his new account does. He'll ask questions like, what's the debit card for? And how do I use the card? And it'll be his wife, the one who came and probably initiated the appointment to separate their finances, who has to be the one who answers where the husband's paycheck is going to go now that the accounts are separated, or what even is his own social security number, or how much money is in their shared joint account. But even before it does, it's worth acknowledging that it is the responsibility of both men and women to understand where each other and where they come from and how we can internalize these responsibilities better. So let's not dwell on this any further. I'm sure you all came here for this. We know what the problem is, and so the better question is, what does change actually look like? Now, I want to start this section with something honest about where I was before any of this mental burden stuff clicked with me. For a long time, I thought I was doing fine. I was trying, and I was better than what I had seen growing up and on social media, and I was still showing up for the big moments, and I genuinely believe that my wife and I were on the same page on everything. But fact of the matter is, we weren't, because about 2 years in, she kept telling me I wasn't putting in the same effort that I was when we first started dating. And from where I was standing, that didn't feel true. Like, it really didn't. Like, I still cared so deeply, and I was still doing the big things, and I still went all out to make sure I showed her that I cared for her, that I loved for her, because she was still the one who decided what we should do on weekends, the one who was keeping track of what we hadn't done in a while, and I just had simply gotten comfortable with handing her that mental labor the same way I handed her everything else that we talked about in this video. Not intentionally, of course, the same way many other men watching this probably feel, but just through the path of the least resistance that comfort in a relationship will always produce. And every time she brought it up, I did what I now recognize as the wrong thing. I responded to the argument instead of the pattern itself. I would plan something, or I would clean something better, or I would try to take more initiative, and she would feel better, and I would feel like I fixed it. And then 2 months later, we were back in the same place. I thought that I was solving the problem, but in reality, I was just performing the solution without internalizing what the problem actually was. What eventually changed wasn't just a single conversation that finally landed differently. It was more gradual than that, really. I just started thinking about it. A little bit over time, after each argument, it really started to sit with me. On my own, unprompted, the way she had already been doing things for her whole life, for years. I would plan for all the things we would start to do on weekends, even if it was small and something that both of us would enjoy. I would do whatever it takes to show her that I thought about her, even when she isn't in the room that she was asking me to. Because that's what internalization actually looks like. The difference difference between performing change because you want to avoid an argument and internalizing change because you understand why it matters isn't always visible from the outside, but it's everything from the inside. I want to be very clear that this does not happen overnight. It took several arguments across several months before anything actually stuck, but what made the difference realistically was that it wasn't just me getting it and taking time. It was also that my wife had the patience to keep voicing her frustrations without blasting me on social media or venting to everyone we know. She noticed when I was sincerely trying, and even when my trying was very slow and also very imperfect, she still gave me patience when she didn't have to, and I always want to thank her for always being so understanding of me. My mission with these videos is to always leave you feeling like you actually feel more hopeful about the world and leave you feeling empowered to actually do something about it, about our relationships, about our politics, about everything, because there's a lot more that's worth talking about, and I'd rather talk about it with people who do want to think it through. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.